Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rao's IAS.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 30th of January 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen and you can clearly see the impact of yesterday's economic survey in today's coverage.
But this is not the economic survey for which the Rao's IAS study circle is known for, because that, as we all know, is done by Baswa sir, who is going to come up with his own series on economic survey, where he is going to meticulously break down each and every important point of economic survey 2020 and 21 from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. So this is a news which appears on page number 10. Bare necessities gap between states has narrowed down since 2012, survey shows. And so the economic survey has come up with a very unique index, which is bare necessities index. And according to which, poorer states have reduced the gap with rich states in providing citizens with access to basics of daily life. For example, housing, water, sanitation, electricity, cooking gas, all of these. And so this particular index, which uses existing National Statistical Office survey data to show that between 2012 and 18, serious gains were made in the area of sanitation, electricity coverage, and various other features, mainly due to the government schemes and policies. So what we are going to do is that first we will understand the targets set out by these schemes, then we will understand what was the actual achievement of these schemes. All this has been given in the economic survey, and then finally we will understand the bare necessities index as well. Now this discussion is going to be extremely relevant for GS paper 2, where you are expected to understand the issues and challenges plaguing the schemes and policies dealing with the vulnerable sections. So let us now start with Swachh Bharat mission, both urban as well as rural. And if you remember, the objective of rural Swachh Bharat mission was to attain open defecation free or ODF India by October 2019 by providing access to toilet facilities to all rural households in the country. Similarly, there was an urban component as well, the target of which was to achieve 100% scientific processing of municipal solid waste. Now, if we talk about the achievements, under the rural component, the coverage has made an incredible leap in the target achievement with more than 10 crore toilets built across rural India. Similarly, with a view to sustain the gains made under the program in last 5 years and to ensure that no one is left behind, in order to achieve the overall cleanliness in villages, even the phase 2 of Swachh Bharat Mission Grameen was launched, and now the focus has shifted from construction of toilets to ODF sustainability and solid and liquid waste management, just like urban mission. If you talk about that component, around 4,327 urban local bodies have been declared ODF so far. And again, to sustain the achievements made during the first phase, the mission is now focusing on holistic sanitation through ODF Plus and ODF Plus Plus protocols. Now let us know in the comment section as to what ODF Plus and Plus Plus means. As far as housing is concerned, we know government launched Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, which intends to provide housing for all in urban and rural areas by 2022. And so according to economic survey, as on January 2021, more than 1 crore houses have been sanctioned, out of which around 40 lakh houses have already been handed over to the beneficiaries. Whereas if we talk about the rural component, which is Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Grameen, there the achievement is far more bigger, where around 1.22 crore houses have been built and handed over to the beneficiaries of the program. Then as far as access to clean water is concerned, we know that government is running Jal Jeevan Mission. And if we talk about the aim of Jal Jeevan Mission, it is to provide functional tap water connection, or acronymed as FTWC, to every rural household by 2024. And so let us see where we are at right now as far as the implementation of this scheme is concerned. And according to economic survey, as on January 2021, 3.2 crore rural households have been provided with functional tap water connection since the launch of the mission. And keeping with no one is left out principle, 18 districts in country spread across Gujarat, Telangana, Himachal Pradesh, Jammu Kashmir, Goa and Punjab have become Har Ghar Jal districts. Then as far as access to electricity is concerned, we know government launched Saubhagya or Sahaj Bijli Har Ghar Yojana. with the objective to achieve universal household electrification by providing electricity connection to all willing unelectrified households in rural areas and all willing poor households in urban areas. And if you remember, the government has also created a portal, and as far as that Saubhagya portal says, except for 18,000 households in left-wing extremism areas of Chhattisgarh, all states have declared electrification of all households. And then finally, we have Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, which was to provide clean cooking fuel to poor households with a target to provide 8 crore deposit-free LPG connections. And if you remember, this connection is provided in the name of an adult women member of a poor family, and the beneficiary has an option to avail connection with 14.2 kg or 5 kg cylinder. Under this particular scheme, the target to provide 8 crore new LPG connection has already been achieved in 2019 itself. That is 7 months in advance of the target date of 31st March 2020. So all these 5 schemes cater to the very bare minimum necessities of human existence. And so that is why Economic Survey has come up with Bare Necessities Index. And this exemplifies the basic need approach to economic development, which focuses on minimum specified quantities of basic necessities such as food, clothing, shelter, water and sanitation that are necessary to prevent ill health and undernutrition. And so the data for developing this particular Bare Necessity Index or BNI is sourced from 2 NSO rounds on drinking water, sanitation, hygiene and housing condition in India, that is in 2012 and 2018 for comparison purposes. So the data was already collected by NSO. What Economic Survey has done is that it has compiled all these data and chosen indicators to compare various states in India, and these are water, sanitation, microenvironment, housing and some miscellaneous factors. Let us understand them quickly. So as far as the first dimension, which is water, is concerned, the Economic Survey has looked into 4 major factors. First is principal source of drinking water, whether it is piped water into the dwelling or not. Similarly, the distance which is traveled to fetch the water from the principal source. And that is also one of the very important parameters in determining access to water. If you have to travel 5 to 10 kilometers, obviously your access to water is reduced. The Economic Survey has also looked into method of taking water. That is, whether it is through tap or through a vessel which is dipped into a lake. Economic Survey has also gone into the nature of access to that water. For example, whether that water source is exclusively reserved for the family household or that is for the community purpose, because that is also very important. So these 4 indicators have been taken into water dimension. Then comes the sanitation, where Economic Survey has looked into access of the household to latrine, whether it is exclusively for the household or not, and the type of facility which are being provided to that particular latrine, whether it has piped sewer system, septic tank, whether it is a single pit or not. The Economic Survey has also taken into account the microenvironment of the dwelling unit. And in that, mainly 2 parameters are included. Drainage system of the household, whether there is a drainage or not. And the second one is that whether that place or area has been infested with insects like flies or mosquitoes or not. Because ultimately that is an important determination of the sanitation status, right? Then, of course, housing is an important factor, whether the condition of the structure of the household is good or bad, and whether the type of dwelling is independent or it is being shared among various households. And finally, some miscellaneous indicators like ventilation in the household, access to electricity, and access to clean cooking fuel. And so combining all these indicators as a percentage of household, Economic Survey has done some very meticulous state-wise comparison. And the first observation is, of course, that there is an improvement in bare necessities across India if you combine both rural as well as urban from 2012 to 2018. So here on the left hand side you see the BNI for 2012 data, and on the right hand side you see BNI for 2018 data. BNI below 0.5 has been plotted in red color. And the first difference which you observe from this map to that one is the stark reduction in red color, which means that most of the states are now above 0.5 and in the range of 0.5 to 0.7. Also, there is a steep increase in the distribution of green color, which means that now a lot of states have gone above 0.7 BNI, which are Kerala, Gujarat, Punjab, Haryana, Uttarakhand, Sikkim and Mizoram. Of course, Goa had high BNI even in 2012. Similarly, the picture of rural India also looks very good because in 2012, most of the states had BNI less than zero point 0.5 as far as their rural regions were concerned. Whereas you can see clear drastic reduction in BNI for rural India as well. And of course, the condition of urban India is far better than that of rural India, where you can see most of the states have BNI above zero point 0.7. Now, this discussion is very important because to start with, it discusses bare necessity index developed by economic survey. And the second is that it demonstrates the importance of economic survey, not just paper 3, but also in GS paper 2 and essay. Two very important articles appearing on page number 10. High out-of-pocket expenses for health can lead to poverty. So economic survey has stated a long known fact, which is that India has one of the highest level of out-of-pocket expenditures, contributing directly to high incidence of catastrophic expenditures and ultimately leading to poverty. And the second one is agility is key to countering pandemic, where it uses a very key term, which is saliency bias. Economic survey says that healthcare policy must not become beholden to saliency bias where policy overweighs a recent phenomena. And so in this respect, we are going to understand what economic survey has to say about India's current state of affairs as far as health is concerned. And this discussion is going to be extremely important from the perspective of GS paper 2, where it clearly lays down issues related to health and education as a part of the syllabus. So we all know that recent COVID-19 pandemic has emphasized the importance of the healthcare sector and its linkage with other key sectors of the economy. And we know that health of a nation depends critically on its citizens having access to an equitable, affordable and accountable healthcare system. Better health is directly reflected in the better economic growth of a country through labor productivity, declined economic burden of illness. So for example, a World Health Organization report has said that increasing life expectancy from 50 to 70 years could raise the economic growth by 1.4 percentage points per year. So these are just the economic reasons for improving the health of the economy. Of course, because this is an economic survey. But the better health of each and every individual is an end in itself and not a means to achieve something. And so a whole chapter of economic survey is dedicated to current state of affairs of India's healthcare. And it has highlighted the current issues which are plaguing India's healthcare system. And let us understand them one by one. First and foremost is, of course, India's health outcomes are very poor. As you can see, despite improvements in maternal mortality and infant mortality rate, India still needs to improve significantly on these matrices. Countries such as China, Bangladesh, Bhutan and Cambodia have improved much more in the same period of time than India. And these are just few of the indicators which we have taken. Then, India is still marred by the fact that the access to the health services and its utilization is very low in India. So hospitalization rates in India are 3 to 4%, which are among the lowest in the world. Now the same statistics for a middle income country is about 8 to 9% and for OECD countries it is about 15 to 17%. The India is observing very high out of pocket expenditures. And as you can see in the figure, India has one of the highest levels of out of pocket expenditure in the world. If you compare, India is placed right beside Bangladesh, whereas other countries which are emerging economies, for example China and Thailand, there the amount of money which people have to shell out for hospitalization and other medical purposes is very low, and that is mainly because of low budgetary allocations for healthcare, or in other words, low public spending in health systems. We know that health is a state subject in India, and if you look at India's overall state-wise distribution of spending on healthcare, it varies drastically, and so there is a vast amount of disparity in the overall spending across India, and so that is reflected in the out-of-pocket expenditure of people belonging to various states as well. So as you can see on your screen, this graph denotes on y-axis the out-of-pocket expenditure and on the x-axis per capita state health expenditure. And so if you see, the states like Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh and Mizoram spend a lot of amount on health, and so that is why the out-of-pocket expenditure in these states are very low. Then we have a problem of very low human resource for health. Because health status of any country crucially depends on the available health infrastructure in general and human resource for health in particular. And again, just like low budgetary allocation for healthcare is dependent on the state efforts, the low human resource for health has also a state bias in it. And so the diagram which you see on your screen shows that only Kerala is a state which has adequate amount of human resource for health. Rest each and every state can be categorized into less than adequate density and less than minimum density, and most of the states in India have less than minimum density of human resource in our country. And so this also, being a state subject, has a disparity which can be explained from the point of view of state efforts. And then finally, we have a problem of unregulated private sector in healthcare, which is marked by high market failure. Now, private healthcare is important because while the share of public institutions has increased both in the number of hospitals as well as number of outpatient cares, the private sector dominates in total healthcare provision in India. And around 74% of outpatient care and 65% of overall hospitalization care is being provided through the private sector in urban India. And if you compare the cost of treatment between public and private sector for the same kind of disease, as you can see on the screen, there is a vast difference. And if you plot the same data on a state-wise and a city-wise manner, there is also a stark difference. And so that is why there is a need for a regulation. So these are the major issues plaguing our health sector. And so what is a saliency bias? Now, saliency bias is the bias of the policymakers to design the future course of action based on a recent phenomena. And so recent phenomena, which is a communicable disease, and the pandemic of this level is unlikely to strike within few years or maybe decades. And if we are able to address these issues highlighted in the economic survey, we will be better prepared to handle even these kinds of pandemic. But as the country is going through demographic transitions, there are few trends which are clearly visible, and that is the proportion of communicable and non-communicable diseases are changing in our society. So what you see on the screen is a percentage of all deaths plotted against the number of years. And so this line in the red is the number of deaths caused due to communicable maternal, neonatal and nutritional diseases. And this line in black color or dark brown color shows the number of deaths caused due to non-communicable diseases, and you can see by 2020 this forms the major share of overall deaths. And so the focus of health system of India needs to focus on non-communicable diseases, because if you leave 2020 aside, this is going to cause around 60% of overall deaths in India in future, and this is increasing. And if you break down the deaths caused due to each and every disease, if you look in 2019, the number one killer was heart disease. That has retained its position of number one. But in 2009, the disease which killed most number of people after heart disease was diarrheal disease, which is related to sanitation and infection, which is kind of communicable, has dropped down to the fourth number. Similarly, neonatal disorders have dropped down to fifth level, whereas COPD and deaths due to stroke have risen to 2, 3. So if you look, all top 3 killers are non-communicable in nature. And so that is why the economic survey lays very high emphasis on increasing public spending on health from 1% to at least 2.5% of the GDP. Increasing government spending on health has direct impact on life expectancy. And so these dots which you see on your screen are countries. And so higher the public expenditure, higher is the expectancy rate. And India is placed over here. Similarly, using the data, they also show that increasing public spending on health has negative correlation with maternal mortality rate. Higher the public spending on health, lower will be the mortality rate. And so because of these reasons, economic survey insists on not falling in the trap of saliency bias rather than focusing on the long-term issues which have plagued the healthcare sector. Let us now move on to the next news. India's ratings don't reflect economy's fundamentals, says CEA or the Chief Economic Advisor. Now, according to the economic survey, India's sovereign credit ratings do not reflect the economy's fundamentals. And according to this document, never in the history of sovereign credit ratings has the fifth largest economy in the world been rated as low as India is being rated right now. And so in this regard, we are first going to understand what sovereign credit ratings are, what has been the traditional standing of India, how they are calculated, what are the parameters which are adopted for calculation of these ratings, and why the placement of India in the lowest category in the investment grade is not justified. And so that is why we'll derive that India's sovereign credit ratings should not trouble India's policy thinking. Starting with what are these credit ratings? So sovereign credit ratings seek to quantify issuers or the debt issuers or the security issuers' ability to meet debt obligations. So when a country takes loans, investors want to know whether this country has the capacity to pay back its loan or not, because there are more than 190 countries in the world, and so not all are very famous. And so based on various parameters, mainly these three agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's and Fitch, come out with these ratings which are utilized by big investors who ultimately invest in government securities. And so when favorable, these can facilitate countries' access to global capital markets as well as foreign investments. If the country's ratings are good, that means that country will definitely pay back the loans, and if it is not good, then that means it is a risk, and so the amount of interest charged by the investor will be massive. In last 30 years, the only times that the sovereign credit ratings of the fifth largest economy has declined massively, China became the fifth largest economy in the world, that is in 2005, and finally when India became the fifth largest economy in the world. Whichever country occupies the fifth largest economy in the world gets AAA credit rating, which is very good. But only when China becomes the fifth largest economy, it gets A3 or BBB plus rating. When India becomes fifth largest economy, it gets even poorer, BB minus or Baa3, which is just above the lowest investment grade. If your rating falls below this, these agencies advise investors not to invest because they think the countries would not be able to return that amount. And if you look at India's ratings in past 20 years, it has always been in B category, which basically means on the lowest pedestal in investment grade. One step down would devoid you of a lot of foreign capital. So according to the economic survey, this placement of India in the lowest rung of investment grade is unjustified, and the document has some very credible points to support its claim, and these are quite factual. The economic survey says that let us go into the parameters which are utilized to calculate these ratings. We know they are GDP growth rate, the level of inflation in the country, the general government debt, current account balance, sovereign default history, whether the country has defaulted in the past or not. So these are hardcore economic parameters. But there are some other political and social factors also. For example, political stability of the country. So if the country is not politically stable, it doesn't matter whether it is economically sound or not. If there will be internal strifes or civil wars, the country would not be able to pay the loan. Then the level of corruption, rule of law, and overall ease of doing business are some of the indicators which are utilized by these agencies. And if you look at India's performance on these ratings, India consistently has been one of the most rapidly economies across the world, while maintaining very low inflation rates. If we talk about general government debt, not only does India has very low foreign currency denominated debt of the sovereign, but also India is very comfortably placed as far as foreign exchange reserves are concerned that can easily pay for whatever small amount of foreign debt India has. Then India's current account balance is also low and it is not increasing with time. And one of the most important factor, India has never ever in its history has defaulted on the sovereign debt, which is kind of an indication of willingness of the country to repay the loan, and no one can raise question over that. Similarly, no one can question the stability of India's political system, although there are some issues on the levels of corruption, but that has never mined India's stability. Similarly, India's rule of law is unquestioned, and we can see the constant improvement India is making on ease of doing business. And so that is why economic survey says that despite being ranked very low by these agencies has had no impact on India's Sensex, India's foreign exchange rate, India's yield on government securities, and inflow of foreign investment. In fact, if you look in last 5 to 10 years, India has been one of the highest recipients of the foreign investment for a size of economy that India is. And so The answer to the question, should India's sovereign credit rating worry Indians? According to the economic survey, it is a big no. So from the perspective of prelims as well as mains examination, the question whether India's sovereign credit rating reflects India's fundamentals or not, and if not, why not, is an important one. Also, these parameters should be kept in mind from the perspective of prelims examination. Increase ration shop prices of wheat and rice appears on page number 10. And so economic survey has recommended that central government must increase the prices which 80 crore people pay for subsidized rice and wheat at ration shops to trim the bulging food subsidy bill. And so in this regard, we are going to first understand what this bill is all about. What is central issue price which is used in this particular news, and then we will understand why this subsidy bill has always kept on increasing and why economic survey is recommending the increase in the prices of the food grains. Starts from farms and reaches to the beneficiary, and how it changes hand, especially from FCI to state government and finally to fair price shop from where the pack of grain is picked up by the beneficiary. Two important key terms were MSP and CIP. Now MSP is the minimum support price, which is the price at which food grains are bought from the farmers. Now it serves two purposes. Now on one hand, it provides assured income to farmer, but at the same time it also ensures food subsidy to the poor people. Now what MSP will be in the given season is recommended by CACP, which is Commission for Agricultural Costs and Prices, and it is declared by the central government. Keep in mind these two important differentiation, which is declaration and recommendation, and these two are done by different agencies. It is also important at the same time to remember CIP, which is Central Issue Price, which is the price at which food grains are allocated to states. So if you go to the DNS, you will understand in detail that first FCI procures food grains from the farmer and pays the farmer in terms of MSP, which is minimum support price. Then FCI allocates the same food grains to the states, and states pay the FCI CIP, which is the central issue price, which is also the price which beneficiary has also to pay to the fair price shops. Now the problem is that CIP are much less than MSP. So as you can see on this screen, there is a comparison, and the reason that CIPs are kept so low to ensure that states' expenditure on carrying out the food subsidy in our country is minimal. Whereas if you see, MSP keeps on increasing every year. So if we talk about the food subsidy expenditure of the central government, that is MSP plus additional cost, which mainly includes the storage and the transport, minus CIP. So this is the amount which is spent by the central government, whereas this is the amount which it gets in the return. And the difference between them is food subsidy expenditure. And so that is why economic survey has suggested to increase the central issue price of these food grains so that the food subsidy bill of the government can be rationalized. News appearing on page number 1. Economic survey predicts 11% growth next fiscal. According to the economic survey, India's economy is firmly in the middle of a V-shaped recovery and will bounce back to record 11% growth in 2021 and 2022 fiscal year after an estimated 7.7 contraction this year. This particular article also mentions the reasons behind the lockdown. So we will first understand that. Then we will go on and understand the short-term measures taken by the government along with the long-term reforms taken in this particular year, and also how the economic survey says that there is going to be a V-shaped recovery based on a lot of indices data. So as we all know that world has gone through an year of unexpected onslaught by novel coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2, first identified in Wuhan city of China in December 2019. And so the virus has posed an unprecedented challenge for policymakers globally and especially for India. And so faced with an unprecedented pandemic and the resultant uncertainty, India devised its own strategy. And according to economic survey, India devised its own strategy because of India's unique vulnerabilities. Now, first and foremost, you need to understand that the pace of spread of a pandemic depends upon the network effects. And basically the virus spreads from human to human contact. And so India's huge population combined with its very high density meant that the virus would spread at a very rapid rate in India as compared to anywhere else. Apart from that, we need to understand that although the average age is very low in India right now, but if you look into the absolute numbers, India has a vast elderly population, and so overall it makes our population highly vulnerable. And finally, the Indian health infrastructure is overburdened. India would not be able to cater to the deluge of patients coming into the hospitals. And so that is why India imposed one of the most severe lockdowns, not just the most severe, but also the most long lasting lockdowns if you compare it with anywhere in the world. And so this ensured the flattening of the curve, ensuring lower morbidity and very low mortality rates. And it also provided the necessary time to ramp up the health and testing infrastructure. At the same time, it had its own impact on economy of India, as we all know that it has contracted during this while. And so the economic survey has summarize the short term as well as the long term measures, which we will look into shortly. But before that, let us understand the justification given by the government behind imposing the lockdown and quickly understand what does the flattening of the curve means. Now this curve you see on your screen has on y-axis the number of cases and on the x-axis time since the first case, and these are just the projections. And so you can see two shapes, and the shape of the curve varies according to the rapidity with which the infection spreads in the community. There is a peak of the disease where the number of infected individuals reaches a maximum, and you can see two peaks, one here and another here. And then that is followed by a decline. So decline is there in both the cases. Now the policymakers care very much about the time taken to reach this peak because this determines the time available to respond to early signs of pandemic. The peak number of infected individuals, in this case this number of patients, in this case that number of patients, because it determines the scale of medical facilities which would be required to cater to this demand. Overloaded healthcare systems that are forced to operate beyond their capacity lead to higher case fatality rates. And so what lockdown does is that it converts the pandemic from this shape to that shape. Here an important factor is the capacity of the healthcare infrastructure, and let's say for a country like India, this is the amount of cases which hospitals can cater to. And if there is no lockdown, the number of cases will go unimpeded, they will rise very sharply, and so all these cases, all these patients will not be able to get any kind of health facility. Whereas if you impose the lockdown, the spread of the virus will be slow, and by the time it reaches its peak, you have already learned a lot about the virus, and even if it reaches the peak, it is within the capacity of the healthcare infrastructure to cater to this particular peak demand, and so it reduces the number of mortality which the country would observe. And therefore, according to the economic survey, this strategy was based on a shloka from Mahabharata. Saving a life that is in jeopardy is the origin of dharma. Or in Sanskrit, apadi pranaraksha hi dharmasya prathamankur. And this is an important quote which you can memorize to be used in essay. That first priority is to save life. And so when the people criticize that the lockdown had a lot of impact on India's economy and it increased the inequality, that is first justification against it. Economic survey moves on to justify the economic revival of our country by stating short-term and long-term measures. And let us discuss them. Now we obviously know that public health response needed to slow transmission of COVID-19 together with the need for social distancing and minimizing contact meant that service sectors reliant on face-to-face interactions, particularly wholesale and retail trade, hospitality, arts and entertainment, would see definite contractions than manufacturing. Apart from this, it was expected that the daily wage laborers, people forming the lowest strata of the society, would see definite loss of employment during this period. And so, government came up with Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Package, Total Direct Benefit Transfer. And so, the economic survey clearly puts out the data as to how much amount has been transferred to each of these vulnerable sections. For example, the amount transferred to the women account holders, aged widows, Divyang and senior citizens, to the farmers, construction workers, through rapid building and construction in government sites, 24% contribution to EPFO, and Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana. All this amounts to around 70,000 crore rupees in a span of over 8 months. So these are of course short-term measures. And that has also reflected in monthly average balances in PMJDY accounts, because if you see, just after the imposition of lockdown, there is a sharp increase in the monthly average balances in Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana accounts. So these are just not the claims of the government, rather it is substantiated by solid facts as well. So these were the short-term measures, but utilizing the opportunity provided by the pandemic, the government has brought in long-term and much awaited reforms in a lot of sectors. And let us go through them. And here is the importance of economic survey, because when you understand and memorize these reforms, you can use them in various places, whether it is GS2, GS3, or even in your essays. And all these steps have been categorized by Government of India as Atmanirbhar Bharat package, are a slew of multi-sectoral supply-side structural reforms. And India is the only country to have undertaken such structural reforms on the supply side at the very initial stages of the pandemic. And let us quickly go through them, starting with the agriculture sector. And we know how existing laws have kept the Indian farmer enslaved to the local mandi and their rent-seeking intermediaries. So while every other category of producer in India had the freedom to decide where to sell, the Indian farmer did not have this freedom. Local monopolies created by this legal infrastructure enabled the intermediaries to prosper at the cost of the farmer, especially the poor ones without the capacity to store their produce. Now these set of 3 laws, which have already been discussed multiple times in our DNS, will enable creation of one India, one market for agri products, will create innumerable opportunities for the farmers to move up the value chain in food processing from farm to fork and create jobs and increase incomes. As far as MSME sector goes, the government came up with new definitions of MSME, which covers almost 99% of all firms, enabling MSME to grow in size and create more jobs. Also, the government has removed artificial separation between manufacturing and services MSMEs. Now, the modified definition of MSME facilitates expansion and growth of these enterprises without them fearing the loss of government incentives, thereby avoiding the phenomena which has already been discussed in our DNS known as dwarfism, where an MSME would refuse to grow bigger simply because they will lose the benefits. Then, as far as the labor sector is concerned, the government has enacted 4 labor codes, mainly Wage Code, Industrial Relations Code, Code on Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code, and the government has also enabled 1 labor return, 1 license and 1 registration to ensure the ease of doing business in our country. According to Economic Survey, these historic labor reforms, which have been discussed for over 3 decades since 1991, have been finally implemented. Then as far as BPO sector is concerned, the government has simplified the guidelines of Department of Telecom, and so several requirements which prevented companies from adopting work from home or work from anywhere have been removed. If you consider the power sector, government has adopted various measures for progressive reduction in cross subsidies, which is basically subsidizing the household sector by charging extra from the commercial sector, time-bound grant of open access, and also the steps toward privatization of distribution companies in union territories. Then the strategic decision taken by the government in public sector undertaking sector. The government has decided to do away with PSUs in non-strategic sector, and it is going to retain only those PSUs which cater to the strategic needs of our country. Then as far as mineral sector is concerned, the government has allowed commercial mining in coal sector, which has been a long talked about reform. Then the government has removed the distinction between captive and merchant mines. More transparent auction methods of mining blocks have been adopted. And then finally, the government has introduced composite exploration cum mining cum production licensing regime. So earlier, the bidding used to be separate for exploration and mining, and now it has been combined to enable ease of doing business for the private sector. Then as far as industry is concerned, Production link incentive scheme have been implemented in 10 key specific sectors to make Indian manufacturers globally competitive, attract investment in the areas of core competency and cutting edge technology, which will ultimately ensure efficiency and create economies of scale. Because this is outcome and output oriented scheme where incentives will be paid only if the manufacturers make the goods and not before they start the production of the good. As far as space is concerned, the government has enabled level playing field to private companies in satellite launches and space-based services. Also, the government has adopted liberal geospatial data policy for providing remote sensing data to tech entrepreneurs. Then as far as defense sector is concerned, the government has taken solid steps towards corporatization of Ordnance Factory Board. FDI limit in defense manufacturing under automatic route is to be very soon raised from 49 to 74%, and the government has floated time-bound defense procurement process, which is going to address the delays in the procurement of defense equipments. Then if we talk about education sector, there are two steps which have been mentioned by Economic Survey, PM E-Vidya and Manu Darpan. PM E-Vidya is to enable multi-mode and equitable access to education. Now what it will do is that it will enable multi-mode access to education. So now the massive online education programs of the government can be accessed not only through internet but also through TV, radios, and so the government is going to come up with one class, one channel from class 1 to 12, each channel catering to each standard. For example, there will be a separate channel dedicated to class 5th, and then similarly there will be channels for competitive exam preparation run by the government itself, for example IIT JEE and NEET preparation. And so that's why it's multi-mode and equitable access to education. Then Mano Darpan initiative will cater to the psychological needs of the students. Then there are various steps which the government has taken to improve the ease of doing business. The government has allowed direct listing of securities by Indian public companies in some of the foreign jurisdictions. Then the provisions have been made which ensure very less amount of time for completion of rights issue by the companies. And then private companies which list in NCDs on stock exchanges will not be regarded as a listed company. And as far as the administration goes, which is very key in improving the doing business, the government has announced National Recruitment Agency to conduct a common eligibility test. The government has revised guidelines on compulsory retirement to remove ineffective or corrupt officials. Then the government has ensured faceless tax assessment and a 12-point taxpayers charter has been released. And finally, the empowered group of secretaries have been created for fast tracking the investment. So these were the set of long-term measures. And according to the government, these short-term combined with the long-term measures and also the resilience of the Indian economy is now being reflected in form of India's economic revival post-pandemic, and that is why it is being called V-shaped recovery. Because if you plot most of the indicators which track the growth of the economy, for example, index of industrial production, purchasing managers index manufacturing and services, and so economic survey using this chart is predicting a sharp V-shaped revival of India's economy. So this particular discussion is very important for the people who are going to appear in the interview, because they could be asked to justify the reason behind such a stringent lockdown, and there you can quote this shloka and talk about how economic survey defends this lockdown and also simultaneously the steps taken by the government which are short term and long term which have helped in India's V-shaped recovery. Let us now move on to the next discussion. Withdraw forbearance once economy recovers appears on page number 10. Now survey has warns that treating loosened norms as staple diet can have detrimental consequences for banks and the economy. And it has prescribed an early withdrawal of the regulatory forbearance that was adopted in the wake of pandemic to ward off the threat of financial sector failures impacting the real economy. And so in this context, let us first understand what regulatory forbearance in banking means. And so in the most simple terms, it means relaxations given by the regulatory authority, in our case, which is RBI. So the term regulatory forbearance means giving certain exemptions from complying with the regulatory requirements. And so in case of banking sector, we know that RBI provides certain leeway to banks to comply with its regulations. It is normally provided to enable the banks to tide over the tough economic conditions, for example, global financial crisis of 2007 and 8. And so when it happened, the RBI enabled the banks to undertake debt restructuring of stressed assets. These assets continued to be categorized as standard assets. This in turn reduced the provisioning requirements of the banks and hence enabled the banks to provide enhanced credit to kickstart the economy. And so when the COVID happened, RBI allowed the banks to carry out these debt restructuring of the loans given to corporates as well as individuals. And what Economic Survey has argued that the regulatory forbearance should act as an emergency medicine or a measure which should be adopted very rarely and not frequently like a staple diet. Economic Survey makes the case for early withdrawal of relaxations provided by RBI during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so obviously we should understand what are the benefits and what are the issues or the challenges with respect to the regulatory forbearance. When we talk about banks, with the kind of relaxations they are given, their balance sheets remain unaffected even if there is recession in the economy. The requirements for provisioning become lower and hence higher capital is available for providing credit. Now of course this credit is provided to the corporates and hence they benefit in the sense that their access to credit increases, and also the relaxations enable bailout of credit-worthy corporates whose finances were affected by the low turn in the economy. And what it does is that it enables the credit creation for the economy in general. Due to regulatory forbearance, the balance sheets of the banks remain unaffected due to loan defaults. This enables the banks to enhance credit creation and rescue the Indian economy. But if Economic Survey has recommended the withdrawal of these relaxations, there must be some serious issues with them. And yes, there are. Because first and foremost, as far as banks are concerned, it leads to the erosion in their capital. Because most of the banks do not show the true status of their balance sheets. We know that provisioning requirements are lowered and hence it leads to erosion in their capital. And since most of the loans are restructured, the amount of restructured asset become higher than the NPAs themselves. As far as firms are concerned, due to these relaxations, less creditworthy entities become eligible for loan. And hence, it perpetuates inefficiency in the market, leading to further increase in stressed assets. And so that is why Economic Survey recommends their early withdrawal. Chief Economic Advisor says it is time to switch fiscal gears from cautious stance to counter-cyclical path. And so in this regard, we are going to understand what this counter-cyclical approach is all about. Because we know that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastation it has caused has meant a lot of fiscal spending, a lot of spending from the government. And of course, everyone knows that this extra money which is going to be injected into the economy is going to come from debt. And so the question as to whether the increasing level of the debts will be sustainable in the long term or not has cropped up. An economic survey says that if you follow counter-cyclical methods, the higher growth would ensure debt sustainability. Because always in the past, the interest rate paid by the Indian government on the government securities and bonds has always been less than India's growth rate. And so if the interest rate paid by the government is less than the growth rate, then the constraints on the government no longer exist. And this term is known by the name of interest rate growth rate differential or IGRD. And so India's high growth rate would ensure that the debts will be sustainable. And let us understand that with the help of example. Let's suppose to fuel India's economy in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, government borrows rupees 100 and invests it in the capital investment in economy. 1 year passes by, investments done by India yields 112.8 rupees on rupees 100 invested, whereas the principal and the interest will total amount to 108 rupees. And so if you see, there is a net addition of rupees 4 in the economy, and India can repeat this process. So economic survey says that as long as the growth rate of India is higher than the interest rate charged by the bonds, there is not going to be any problem. And so let us understand these two kinds of fiscal policies. One is pro-cyclical, another one is counter-cyclical. So pro-cyclical means that when there is a recession, government expenditures are reduced and taxes are increased. And when there is expansion, the government expands its expenditure and reduces the taxes. So this is pro-cyclical, which deepens the recession, amplifies expansion, and thereby increases the fluctuation in the business cycle. Whereas counter-cyclical is opposing the cycle which is being followed. If there is a recession, so of course there is a decline in government revenues, but instead of declining the expenditure, the government should increase the expenditure and reduce the taxes, which will increase the spending and investment in the economy in case of recessions. And when there is expansion, the government should reduce the expenditure, because of course people are taking care of the expenditure in the form of private expenses, and we should increase the taxes, which softens the recession and moderates the expansion. So this is counter or anti to the cycle. In response to the people who questions India's debt levels, the economic survey has done a comparison. On the y-axis you see debt as a percentage of GDP, and on the x-axis you see the timeline, and these are the major economies across the world, and India is placed very comfortably in middle of this. Whereas if you see the levels of debt in Japan, they're up to 250% of the overall GDP. And similarly the comparison can be done with the BRICS nations as well, and there also you can see that India has been achieving low debt levels in last 5 to 10 years. And similar is the debt to GDP ratio for India amongst the rest of the world. And here you see India is placed in the bottom at 122% when you compare total debt as a percentage of GDP. When you take into account only government debt, it comes out to be 68%, well below developed countries like Japan, US, UK and China. And similarly, if you talk about just the private debt as a percentage of GDP, it is also in a very comfortable range of 54%. So economic survey clearly establishes that growth leads to debt sustainability in Indian context. And this is mainly because interest rate on debt paid by Indian government has always been less than India's growth rate. And so as COVID-19 pandemic has created a significant negative shock to demand, active fiscal policy in form of counter-cyclical measures, which we have discussed, is going to be very, very effective. And so in this respect, from the perspective of prelims examination, it is very, very important to keep in mind IGRD and counter-cyclical policy.